Where I am, it's all the way up to 14 below, which is a lot warmer than it was this morning earlier. A couple of weeks ago, I noticed something in myself that shouldn't have been unexpected, but it was. I noticed that drop by drop and bit by bit over the last year, probably over the last 4 years, I had lost a lot more of my vital energy than I knew. That I had slipped in increments, so small I didn't notice it happening, into a kind of hiding, a kind of partial shutting down. The day I noticed this was, not at all surprisingly, January 20th, the day of President Biden's inauguration. And I noticed it because on that day, a great relief welled up in me without my even thinking about it. A sense that now I could stick my head out again. I understood that this was the result of the horrible events of the last 4 years, a dangerous and narcissistic president who gave racists full reign and support, ever more people of color being hassled and killed simply for driving or walking while Black, climate change becoming more pronounced, and of course, an ineptly handled pandemic that has already killed in 1 year half the number of Americans who were lost in all of World War II. Now, I'd most definitely been practicing in the face of all these problems. And I figured I'd be okay, and perhaps, well, not perhaps, for sure I would have dug myself into a much deeper hole if I hadn't been practicing. But what had escaped my notice was this bit by bit dripping of my life energy, and instead kind of reverting to a hunkered in sort of thing that I hadn't even noticed. I reverted back to some really deeply ingrained habits of mind. And most importantly, that day of the inauguration, I noticed I hadn't been as happy as I had been before. So of course, the first thought I had was, my God, I get to go to a retreat on growing happiness and wisdom in Zoom times. Aren't I lucky? And then I thought, wait a second, should I be teaching or co-teaching that retreat, giving a Dharma talk when I didn't even realize that I had slid away from this happiness? And then I figured, well, my experience is probably not that much different than a lot of yours. In fact, I've talked to a number of people in the last couple of weeks, and they had the same experience. The good practitioners, many of them, that bit by bit by bit, their happiness had slid away. So here I am. Here we all are. And it's a relief and a bit of joy. I've given a lot of thought about how we can cultivate happiness and wisdom in times like these. And one conclusion I've come up with is that the act of coming to happiness and wisdom is the same, no matter what's going on externally, whether we're in boom times or Zoom times. It may be a bit harder in the hard times, but the process is pretty much the same. It begins, I think, with this understanding, which I've already alluded to, that happiness, or at least the type of happiness I'd like to talk about this morning, is not dependent on external conditions. Whatever is going on in the world, either in the world at large or in our world, I really do believe Thich Nhat Hanh when he says we already have within us everything we need to be happy. All we have to do, he reminds us over and over and over again, is practice to open the door to that happiness. This from a man who lost so many friends, so many loved ones in the war that ravaged his beloved homeland of Vietnam. I think we all know that happiness isn't created by having more possessions, more wealth, more fame. Nor can we be happy when we believe we can control the vast percentage of things that are really beyond our control. Yet those beliefs about what makes us happy are deeply ingrained in us. They're conditioned, hardwired, whatever expression you want to use, they're deep within us. And at one point, say 250,000 years ago, it made sense. Having, say, more food stockpiled or an easily defended dwelling was a matter of survival. And controlling other tribes and groups was help create safety, unless, of course, you were one of the tribes or groups that was being controlled. But the world has gotten so much larger and so much more complex. And these basic tools of survival usually are no longer helpful to us. Yet somehow, today, this early conditioning still lives within us and has translated into a seemingly omnipresent type of materialism, both physical materialism and even spiritual materialism. We just want more. And horribly enough, it has led to the modern manifestation of tribalism, the instinct to turn the world into us versus them, that we've seen on such horrific display in the last 4 years in particular. Anyway, that was how humans were starting 250,000 years ago until about 2,600 years ago, when the Buddha taught us otherwise. He taught us that we don't need external conditions to be just so to be happy. Yes, we still need, of course, food, shelter, clothing. But having more won't make us happy, he taught. And in light of his teachings, we can talk about a different kind of happiness, one that I think we all already aspire to. It's the type of happiness that Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, the peace activist, was referring to when he said, happiness is a deep, instinctive union with the stream of life. I'll say it again because it's really a wonderful definition of what we're talking about here. Happiness is a deep, instinctive union with the stream of life. Excuse me. The Buddha gave us the tools and the path to unsnag ourselves from the conditioned and ancient belief that resides in our bones about happiness. And instead, he gave us the tools he gave us will help us find the happiness that Bertrand Russell described. And that happiness goes hand in hand with a profound and ever-emerging wisdom that we all can experience. In fostering that wisdom and happiness is what I'd like to talk about this morning. Now, the Buddha's teachings are, in a way, simple, or more accurately, his instructions are simple, but embodying those instructions is challenging. I remember on a 10-day retreat, and I couldn't shake monkey mind, and my mind was spinning like a gerbil on a wheel. And during a teacher interview, I told the teacher that this is what was happening. I said, what's so hard? The instructions are simple. And she just said, the instructions are simple. Your mind isn't. And, but the amazing thing about all the Buddha's teachings is that they brilliantly take into account the nature of the mind and how we are, in the absence of mindfulness, conditioned to revert back to the way we were conditioned and move through the world as our long ago ancestors did, based on those faulty assumptions about what can make us happy. Now, in this retreat, we've already followed some of the Buddha's instructions that lead us to happiness. In fact, we followed the most foundational of those instructions, breathing with awareness. And again, I understand that the instructions are simple, but the reality can be difficult. But we practice returning to awareness of our breathing body rather than being dispersed far and wide by the activities of our mind. There's much, much more, of course, to the Buddha's teachings, but it starts with that body awareness and the breath, which brings us back to the present moment. And by the way, when I say breath, again, I'm referring to any technique, such as a mantra, such as placing your attention on a color in your mind, any technique that brings us back to the present moment. I'll just use the word breath out of convenience. But happiness and wisdom are closely related, I believe, because neither is possible in any other moment than the present moment, which is the moment we're practicing returning to when we embody ourselves. Happiness, as Bertrand Russell said, comes from connection, not accomplishment. And when we feel connected to the flow of life, we are automatically ready to be happy. When we're dispersed in our untamed mental processes, happiness is not possible. Here's an example from my own life. Some of you know, and I mentioned briefly last night, I've been dealing with a serious health issue that was first diagnosed in 2013. And at the time, my beloved Mary and I had started taking care of our new first grandchild every Monday. And he was only about 6 months old at the time of my diagnosis. But I had to take some time off from caring for Archer after my diagnosis because I wasn't physically up to it. I just couldn't do it. But after a while, I did feel strong enough to resume. I didn't feel great, but I felt well enough. And on my first day back, I remember so vividly that I was holding the then very young Archer in my arms. And I became aware that even though this beautiful infant was in my arms, I was churning in my mind through my fears, my what ifs, my woe is me's, my how long do I have's, the why me's, and on and on and on. And then I realized when I became aware of that I wasn't actually present for Archer, for myself. So I took a breath and looked down at this amazing new human being. I came back in that moment to the present moment. And in that moment, I felt such joy, such happiness, such connection. I felt life was complete. Nothing was really wrong or out of place. Nothing was missing. And I've told this story before, but it really was a powerful lesson for me in my life. My practice allowed me to feel that kind of happiness, that connection to the flow, if only for a moment. Believe me, it has hardly been a permanent state of mind for me. But it helped me come back to that happiness, if only for a moment. And the more we do that in our practice, the more we do that. The same thing happened last night, actually. My mind was all wrapped up in things about the retreat and this issue and that issue and what I had to do after the retreat. And then, despite the fact that it was below zero, I had to take the dog out. And it was cold. And as I was walking out, I thought, oh my God, it's cold. He better do his business quickly. And all the stuff going around in my mind about other parts of my life. And then I stopped and noticed the stars were out. It was a beautiful night out here in the country. And again, even though I was preoccupied with some other things, I was happy. So these tools that the Buddha gave us are very powerful. And they're tools we all can use, and it begins by taking a breath in mindfulness and returning as often as we can to our breathing bodies so that we can find happiness. And when we do that, our minds are still enough for wisdom to arise. Information and knowledge is ubiquitous in the world, isn't it? I mean, that's what Google is all about, right? But there's a wonderful saying among the native peoples of New Guinea that goes along the lines of knowledge is just a rumor until it lives in the muscle. And when we breathe mindfully and re-embody ourselves when our mind leads to dispersion, we can discern what information is important, understand better the process of embodying it, and to act wisely on that information. So, for example, a beautiful piece of music, say Beethoven's Appassionata, is really just a series of notes until the pianist rehearses and feels the music and understands enough about the music so that it resides in her body, like muscle memory. And when that person plays the Appassionata, it comes from a deep place, a place that can profoundly move us. It's not just a series of notes. And the same is true about the teachings of the wise ones. We can read and read and read those teachings. And don't get me wrong, I think reading is an important part of our practice, absolutely. But ultimately, the only way to embody these wise teachings so that we can live them out is to practice embodying ourselves and re-embodying ourselves. This practice opens the way to some specific characteristics that we can tap into and that lead us into happiness and wisdom. And I'd like to talk about just two of them today. And the first one is, and there's been talk about this all through the retreat, presence, being fully present in the moment, whether we like what's happening in the moment or whether we don't like it. It means, obviously enough, being fully in the moment without judgment or striving to make things different. We're just here, without thinking of the past or planning the future, without the add-ons, and I'm going to use this phrase a lot for the rest of my talk, without the add-ons that we seemingly heap on top of the current situation, the what ifs, the why me's, the coulda, shoulda, wouldas that I was referring to that morning with my grandson. Coming into that presence is what we practice when we take a breath. We are literally making ourselves present in our breathing bodies. Again, not always easy, but we practice. When we're present, our deeply conditioned states of mind, such as greed and aversion and all the seemingly infinite number of permutations of greed and aversion, simply can't control us. So there's no happiness without this presence. There is no connection to the flow of life unless we're present to life in this moment. And this coming back to the present, which again, those of us who meditate and practice this all the time, there's this coming back from the dispersion of our minds is the very definition of mindfulness. Mindfulness, a common misconception is that mindfulness helps us to attain a specific state of mind, a calmness or a clarity of mind. And certainly that happens as we practice. But in reality, our practice isn't about attaining those states of mind so much as it is of practicing coming back from a dispersion. It's coming back to our bodies. Now, we don't automatically become happy when we become present, and sometimes we have to be present to deal with difficult situations. But again, there's no happiness, no deep connection with the flow in any other moment but this one. The second characteristic I'd like to talk about that grows out of embodied presence is deepening our awareness. First, we perceive. Perception is analogous to information. It's easy and effortless to do. When the bell rings, we naturally perceive that the bell rang. It's easy it's effortless. No particular effort is necessary. But where we start to go off the rails is when we pile on the add-ons to the perception. We might think, oh, I hate that bell, or it doesn't sound good over Zoom. Why do people ring bells in Zoom retreats? I've got to stop doing Zoom retreats. And what's wrong with Dave anyway? Why did he ring? Blah, 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 blah. You know, we all know how we can launch into a deep pool of dispersion at the slightest provocation. And the add-ons, of course, take us away from the present moment and put us on a course dictated by our conditioned states of mind. So when we're present, we become aware of the add-ons. We can breathe. We have the opportunity to breathe, or however we do it, and come back into our body. Without judgment, without striving for another outcome, just observing and returning, which is the opposite of dispersion. The problem the Buddha pointed out isn't so much that we have these add-ons. That's human nature. That's, as I mentioned at the outset, hardwired into us, but rather we usually aren't aware of them. And as much as we are aware of them, we cling to them tightly. Yet they automatically trigger and guide our actions in the absence of mindfulness. Actions arise from thought. And if the thought is based on our conditioned habits of mind, and we're not aware of that, we react automatically. So that's among the many, many things we can become aware of if we're present, aware that we're adding on these mental formations and the actions that they automatically trigger. That conditioned reality is not what is happening in this moment. It's just something etched into our brains that we bring forward to this moment and then act out of. So when we become aware, we can stop the automatic reaction, both our mental reactions and physical reactions. A simple way of putting this is what we often say in prison. We tell the incarcerated people that this practice will put a space of a breath between a trigger and the reaction. And the space of that breath is huge, because in the space of that breath, we can choose mindfully to do what to do instead of doing what we automatically do. We tell the incarcerated individuals that this choice that we can give ourselves is a real form of freedom. It's not the physical freedom that they all want, but it's a deep form of inner freedom. And we remind them that on the outside, most of the people they would see walking on the streets are not free in that way. And this is an opportunity for them to make themselves free, whatever their situation. It's true for all of us. And the Buddha used a word for how all these add-ons can run the show, and that word is dukkha, which is often translated, and perhaps not translated very well, as suffering. And this is how the act of mindful breathing, or whatever technique you use, helps us alleviate suffering. I sometimes think of our practice as the great turning toward. Part of our conditioning is to automatically turn away from what we don't like, or what scares us, or is inconvenient. And our practice teaches us to turn toward whatever it is, whether it's a deep challenge, such as we've all been living through, or whether it's happiness. We can turn toward happiness. When we're not present, we can't turn toward happiness, because happiness only occurs now. We all have strategies to turn away from what we don't like and to run after what we do like and to cling to it once we have it. And that behavior is dukkha. So when we become aware, when we first become present and then aware, we break the chain and have the door open to alleviating our suffering. That is liberation. Now, this embodiment of wisdom, this happiness, takes training and practice, and there are no shortcuts. We can't think or read our way out of this type of happiness and wisdom, or to this type of happiness and wisdom. We can only get to this place where abiding happiness and wisdom resides by practicing. There's a often told story, and who knows, it might even be true, about Shantideva, the 8th century saint and teacher. And the story has it that in the last days of his life, he went to sit on a mountaintop above the monastery. And a younger monk from the monastery became obsessed with learning Shantideva's secret before the saint passed away. So he climbed and he climbed and he climbed until he looked over the ledge on which Shantideva sat. And from there, the monk asked, as in the story, "Oh, master, what is your secret of happiness?" And Shantideva didn't say a word. He just stood up, turned around, bent over, lifted his robes, and exposed his bottom, which was calloused from many years of sitting meditation. Now, nobody's suggesting you sit that much, but I am suggesting that an ongoing, consistent practice is essential to finding this kind of deep happiness, this happiness in which we're connected to the flow of life. So besides practicing, this practice requires patience. Our path isn't straight. It's not level, as we all know. It goes up and down, and that's just the nature of things. So we need to be patient in practice without clinging or trying to force results, without trying to force a certain outcome. And the more we try to force it, the less fruitful our practice will become. Believe me, I know that. And besides patience, it takes courage to do this practice. Say what you will about our conditioned habits of mind, our conditioned habit energy. Say what you will about them, but they're familiar. They're the devil we know. And because of that, even though they may be detrimental to us, they're comfortable. And it takes courage then to stop our habits of turning away and instead turn toward what is with great compassion and honesty. And as we practice, we notice some things do start to happen. We don't have to make them happen. They happen on their own. We become, even after a short while of regular practice, less reactive. We just notice it. We don't have to do anything. In my case, I started meditating when I was 18 years old. And within a week or two, I wasn't nearly as much of a smart aleck as I usually was. And some of you know I still can be from time to time. I remember somebody saying something and a smart-ass comment started formulating in my mind. And I remember this was going to be a good one. And then, without even thinking about it, I took a breath and didn't say it. And I remember thinking, where's Dave? But that was, a change that happened without my trying to make it happen. Another thing that happens is we become automatically less fearful about the things that our conditioned mental formations lead us to be fearful about. Yes, bad things happen in the world, as we know too well. And fear isn't always the wrong response, but so much of our fear is based on what's happening. It isn't based on what's happening in the present moment, but rather it's based on what we project will happen in the future. And that projection is a very common add-on, and it leads to fear. So when we work with our fear with mindfulness, we become less fearful. And that's why Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that fearlessness is not only possible, It is the ultimate joy. So again, there's that connection between joy, happiness, and practice. This is how deep and abiding happiness can arise from our practice, even in times like we've been going through. And also that's how wisdom, and much of this wisdom is already within us. It's not necessarily something that we learn so much as unleash. And that's how wisdom can arise as well. But while this practice takes patience, courage, stick-to-itiveness, to use an old-fashioned word, one thing it doesn't require is any particular talent. We can do this. We can do this. We just need to gently keep at it, even when it doesn't feel good. And of course, we know it doesn't always feel good. Now, this happiness is not incompatible with, say, the injustice in our world and our feelings about that injustice. This happiness and wisdom does not shield us from or give us an excuse to avoid that injustice. In fact, it helps us be more present so that we can feel deep compassion, as we discussed last night in the question and the Q&R. Deep compassion for those who are oppressed. And it guides us to act wisely, not automatically. That's why, as I think Stephen mentioned, Thich Nhat Hanh says compassion is a verb. Nor is there anything unboundaried about our action. The practice doesn't make us weaker. It makes us much stronger. When we're present, we're unlikely to let people and conditions walk all over us. And we're much more likely to respond with skill than to react automatically. When we react automatically to difficult situations, as Jan mentioned last night, we only make the situation worse. We get into a loop that I react to somebody and that somebody reacts to my reaction to them, and I react to the reaction, and so on and so on and so on. And soon that situation has escalated. And we talk about that kind of situation a lot in prison. And the guys who have tried mindfulness, who have immersed themselves in mindfulness, soon learn that choosing the right response is almost always, not almost, it is always more productive than reacting automatically. So this is how our practice opens the door to happiness and wisdom, even in the hardest of times. It's how we can be liberated from the instincts that arose in us as a species and that live within us still 250,000 years ago. It's a way that has allowed me to stop fretting at times when I remember to practice, and to just look down into the present moment, to lean into the present moment without expectation, without trying to control things, with less fear. And instead, this practice helps us incline ourselves toward happiness and wisdom. We may have these old habits within us that were ingrained in us early in the time of our species. But the Buddha knew that getting beyond these ingrained habits, this conditioning, and he did say where there is conditioning, there is suffering. The Buddha knew the way to help us get beyond this conditioning. It wasn't forcing ourselves to get beyond the conditioning. It was practicing our way there and embodying the practice. And it all starts with a breath, and then another breath. And then after a while, perhaps of dispersion, another breath. And that is our way to happiness and wisdom. Thank you for your attention. And now let's sit for a little while longer. Thank you.